Mr. President, soon we're going to vote on cloture, and we will move toward, I hope, concluding our consideration of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I have spoken, as our presiding officer knows, over the last few days quite a bit as to why the legislation we're considering today is so important. I think that as we prepare to take this vote, though, that we ought to take maybe just another minute or two and reflect on the bill's merits and the needs that it will address, important needs it will address for our country. In my opening statement several days ago, I reminded the Senate that the state of our nation's infrastructure currently ranks and rates as a C- according to the American Society of Civil Engineers. That's not the infrastructure that the American people want or need in the 21st century. Jurisdiction of the Environment Public Works Committee, which Senator Capito and I are privileged to lead, and which the presiding officer is a new member of. This bill includes language that will make historic investments in our roads, our highways, and our bridges. A 34% increase, if you will, over the last 5 years. The bill will also reauthorize our drinking water and our water sanitation program at robust new levels. As we take this vote, I think it's important to reflect on our past efforts. I want to go back in time, Mr. President, why this vote is so important today. Since I first joined the Congress as a brand new freshman congressman from Delaware in 1982, we have updated our transportation laws in this country some 8 times. 8 times. With each of these efforts, we've tried to improve our policies, address gaps, incorporate new information, and deliver needed resources. The modern era of these transportation laws began in 1991. George Herbert Walker Bush was the president, and Congress passed, and then President Bush signed into law legislation called the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, or ICE-T, as it was called at the time, ICE-T. Until ICE-T, that legislation was adopted, enacted, signed into law. As a matter of federal policy, we divided transportation into separate systems. We had, on the one hand, highways. On the other hand, we had rail. On the other hand, we had transit. And our policies really didn't consider them as a unified, integrated system, which is how most commuters and most travelers in our nation really thought it to be. ICE-T sought to change that. ICE-T sought to change that by requiring integrated regional planning of transportation systems that accounted for and better facilitated connections amongst our highways, our rail, and our transit to enable more efficient freight movement and more efficient movement of people. It was around the same time we also integrated our transportation policy with the Clean Air Act, which represented a major strengthening of our pollution laws to respond to urban smog, acid rain, ozone depletion, and other air pollution problems. For the first time, transportation planning was obliged to take into account pollution from mobile sources and take steps to reduce the considerable contribution of transportation to air pollution. Today's legislation substantially builds on our historic efforts to reduce dangerous emissions, like greenhouse gases and particulate matter, that spew from too many of our cars, our buses, and other modes of transportation. Congress took another major leap in transportation policy a few years later, in 1998, in fact, when the Transportation Equity Act for the 21st Century, also known as T21, which focused on improving safety while advancing America's economic growth and competitiveness. Nearly 10 years later, 2005, as transportation fatalities reached a 10-year height, over 43,000 people. Over 43,000 people. President George W. Bush, son of Herbert Walker Bush, signed into law the Safe, Accountable, Flexible, Efficient Transportation Equity Act, a legacy for users. That's a long title, but we found an acronym for it, SAFETY-LU, in 2005. And at its core, the key to remember is this legislation improved high transportation safety through the creation of the Highway Safety Improvement Program to reduce highway fatalities. Then in 2012, President Obama signed into law the Moving Ahead for Progress in the 21st Century Act, known as MAP 21. Responding to concerns about the growth of the number of small programs, MAP 21 sought to simplify the highway program structure, provide more flexibility to states, while also increasing their accountability and focusing on performance outcomes, including safety, asset conditions, congestion, and air quality. Congress reauthorized our transportation laws most recently in 2015, when President Obama signed into law the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, or FAST. The FAST Act focused on freight movement, supported with new formula and competitive grants for highway and intermodal freight, as well as a focus on federal and state freight planning efforts. Today, our interstate system is still a critical national asset, carrying over a quarter of all motor vehicle travel in our nation, over 1/4, despite being only 1% of all lane miles. These highways have enabled a significant expansion of truck movement, including supporting local businesses, interstate commerce, international trade, and providing Americans with access to low-cost goods and services. Along with the many benefits of interstate highways have come indisputable costs. Highways have spawned sprawling, auto-dependent, and development patterns that exacerbate greenhouse gas emissions, thus compromising our efforts to deal with a changing climate. Interstate highways divide communities and were often intentionally built through minority and low-income families, becoming very tangible evidence of racism. Today, more than 36,000 people lose their lives each year on our roadways, while we seek to maintain the mobility benefits of the federal aid highway system. We must also acknowledge and address these significant detriments. Mr. President, we have been at the hard work of transportation policy for a long, long time in this country, and we have enjoyed major success benefiting our people and our economy. And if we're honest with ourselves, we have made a few mistakes along the way, dividing communities with poorly considered projects, and dividing a transportation sector that produces twice as much greenhouse gas emissions as any other country's transportation sector. We have an opportunity to learn from both success and failure, and we must account for new challenges that were not on our radar screens in the past, not the least of which are the serious threats of climate change and the obvious specter of environmental injustice. Today, we're rising to the challenge. The bill before us, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, includes, among other provisions, the largest federal investment in public transit in history, the largest investment in clean drinking water and wastewater infrastructure in history, the largest investment in clean energy transmission in history, the largest investment in climate resiliency in history, and the largest investment in transportation electrification in history. Infrastructure policy, Madam President, is a little bit like an aircraft carrier. The immediate past presiding officer who just left the podium, retired Navy captain, so am I. And he and I both spent a fair amount of time in airplanes, and he spent a fair amount of time in outer space as an astronaut. And, but we've both spent some time on aircraft carriers. And we know that you can't turn an aircraft carrier on a dime. With the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we are, as we say in the Navy, coming hard about. Coming hard about. Carrier is turning. We're finally recognizing climate change and addressing it. And we're recognizing some of the mistakes of infrastructure policy in the past and fixing them. Before I call for us to invoke cloture, I'm channeling today, of all people, Winston Churchill. I love Churchill. I know he's quoted by a lot of my colleagues as well. One of my favorite quotes from Churchill is, the further back we look, the further forward we see. Another one I especially like from Churchill is, you can always count on America to do the right thing in the end after trying everything else. And it would seem as we've gone through this legislative process, we've tried just about everything else. And we've had a lot of actually surprisingly good debate here on this floor. The offering is Senator Capito, my colleague, my partner in leading the Environment and Public Works Committee, who's done a great job. But we've seen a lot of amendments offered, over 20 to this bill. I think most of them are bipartisan, a bunch of them have been adopted. The other thing I would just offer from Churchill is another one of my favorites. Democracy is the worst form of government, divides by wit of man. Democracy is the worst form of government, divides by wit of man. This is a hard way to govern, and we have learned that again as we've gone through this process. As we prepare to maybe hopefully involve cloture, I again want to say how much I've enjoyed working with our ranking member, Senator Capito, two West Virginians, native West Virginians who have found the common ground on these issues and worked hard to lead our team and with a lot of other committees of jurisdiction. One of them were led by another West Virginian, Joe Manchin. I want to thank all those committees for their good work and for the leadership that we received from our leaders. And with that having been said, let's go ahead and vote. And I hope that we'll invoke cloture and take our critical next step. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.